The room was packed, but you could hear a pin drop. Cameras rolled. Phones stopped buzzing. And as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the page in front of her, something shifted. No slogans, no theatrics. Just one sentence, typed in 12-point font. That made Donald Trump stop mid-breath. His eyes locked on the screen behind her, where his signature now sat in full view, next to a foreign account number no one was supposed to see. For a moment, he didn't yell. He didn't deny. He just froze. This story is a dramatization, but the fear, the silence, the stakes, they're real. Because in an age where truth is buried in footnotes and power hides behind paperwork, sometimes it only takes one line to shatter the script. And today she read it out loud. The fog rolled low over Washington that morning, thick, damp, stubborn. It clung to the windows of the Capitol like something that didn't want to let go. Inside, the air wasn't much clearer. It was the kind of Wednesday that felt like a rerun. Same dull lighting, same half-empty coffee cups, same tired staffers scrolling half-heartedly through the news they were supposed to care about. The Oversight Committee hearing room buzzed with a low static of disinterest. A few aides shuffled papers they didn't intend to read. One Republican congressman sat back with a paperclip between his teeth, texting under the table. On the CSPAN livestream, the screen showed the typical wide shot, room half full, nameplates neatly aligned, nothing new, nothing urgent, until she walked in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't say a word as she entered the chamber. She didn't need to. The sound her heels made against the marble floor wasn't loud, but it was precise, deliberate. She carried a red binder under one arm, faded, thick, and without a single label on its cover. Just a thin elastic band wrapped around it twice. Almost no one noticed it, but those who did stared a moment longer than they meant to. She took her seat near the middle of the row, nodded briefly at the chair, and opened her notepad. No wave to the cameras, no smirk, no grand gesture, just calm like someone who had practiced this moment. Not for applause, but for accuracy. Leo Briggs, her chief of staff, sat 3 rows back. He wasn't taking notes. He was watching the room. That was his job today. He'd been told not to blink. Near the edge of the dais, one junior staffer leaned over and whispered to another, "She brought that binder, didn't she?" The second nodded. "Didn't think she would." A few feet away, Representative Curtis Hale, vocal Trump ally, chuckled under his breath. "She's probably got a speech about recycling in there." He didn't know his mic was on. AOC heard it. She didn't flinch. From the hallway came a late arrival, another member jogging in with a pastry and 2 phones. No one looked up, but Leo clocked it. He tapped the corner of his tablet 3 times, signaling something to the intern beside him. The intern's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. There was tension in the air, but not the kind you could name. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't noise. It was that quiet pressure before a storm, a pressure you only noticed if you were paying attention. Most weren't. But one cameraman, a freelancer covering C-SPAN overflow, whispered into his headset, Stay on her. Something's off." And something was. The binder had been closed for months, its contents reviewed in silence, often at night, sometimes alone. AOC had carried it to 3 previous hearings and opened it during none. It had become something of a myth within her staff, a loaded weapon she refused to fire until she was certain the moment would matter. Now it sat on the table in front of her, slightly off-center, one corner worn. She hadn't opened it yet, but her fingers tapped the top lightly, rhythmically, like a pianist about to strike a note. On her right wrist, a silver bracelet caught the overhead light, a gift from a community leader in Queens, the one who told her 5 years ago, "Never bring the truth unless you're ready to finish the fight." She was ready, and in 3 minutes, the room wouldn't be the same. The session began like so many others, steadily, predictably, and without urgency. The kind of hearing where statements felt more recycled than read. Representative Curtis Hale led off, his voice practiced and even, talking about protecting public trust and avoiding unnecessary distractions. He didn't look up from his notes once. A few polite nods followed, out of form more than agreement. Across the room, staffers typed slowly, more out of routine than necessity. A few members whispered about lunch orders. Others refreshed their screens to check market updates. Outside the hearing room, the Capitol bustled with its own rhythm. Meetings, schedules, stories unfolding elsewhere. But inside, the pace held steady. Too steady. Alexandria sat with a kind of quiet that didn't ask for attention, but often drew it anyway. No laptop in front of her, no phone in hand, just the same legal pad she'd brought into 100 other meetings, a pen she hadn't uncapped, and the red binder resting on the table. Untouched but unmistakable. She hadn't opened it. Not yet. Most people in the room didn't notice. A few did, and the ones who did kept glancing back at it, uncertain why they couldn't stop. 3 seats behind her, Leo watched silently. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't distracted. His eyes moved from face to face, noting who was listening, who wasn't, who had started to shift in their chairs. He knew the signs, when a room was drifting and when it was holding its breath without realizing. 2 aides sitting near the back leaned in slightly, just enough to share a quiet exchange without turning their heads. "She brought that binder," one murmured. The other paused. "You think it's today?" A shrug. "I don't know, but she looks ready." Up at the table, another representative began speaking. Something about procedural integrity and fiscal accountability. It blended in with what came before, and probably with what would come after. But the air had changed, not dramatically, just enough. Not everyone could feel it, but some did. A clerk tapped her pen against her folder, stopped, and looked up. A photographer adjusted her lens and kept it steady on AOC longer than usual. The kind of attention you don't announce, but don't explain either. Even the sound in the room seemed different. It wasn't that it had gone quiet. It was the kind of stillness that made you aware of how often rooms are filled with noise you never notice. Shuffling, whispering, small rustlings of paper and habit. And then suddenly that noise was gone. Alexandria turned one page in her pad gently. Her hand rested on the edge of the binder. Not gripping it, just there. Present. She didn't speak, didn't move again, but something about the moment settled in. Not like thunder, more like the first drop of rain hitting a window before the rest of the storm arrives. The binder remained closed, but everyone paying attention felt something in the room had just opened. It came not with a bang, but a question. Soft-spoken, steady, and placed carefully between the end of one prepared remark and the beginning of another. Alexandria looked up, not dramatically, just with the same composed clarity she'd carried all morning, and said, "Mr. Chairman, is this committee aware of a flag transfer dated July 14th, 2022, involving Tri-West Holdings?" There was a pause, not long, but long enough to notice. One of the representatives who had been mid-sip of coffee stopped with the cup halfway to his mouth. Another, who had been idly scrolling through headlines, blinked and slowly placed her phone screen down on the table. A chair creaked across the room. A paper stopped mid-turn. The chairman, momentarily caught between routine and something unfamiliar, adjusted his glasses. "Would you repeat that?" he asked, though not because he hadn't heard her. It was more the tone, the way the words had landed. Calm, yes, but also intentional. Anchored. Alexandria did not repeat herself. She didn't need to. The screen behind her had already begun to change. One of her aides, sitting quietly by the text station, had been waiting for that cue, unspoken but understood. The display lit up, a clean wire diagram with transaction lines drawn from one account to another. Tri-West Holdings, July 14th, 2022. The receiving bank listed as a small firm in Zurich. Amount $3.2 million. Notated with a code, Atlas 12. The screen wasn't flashy, no bold red arrows or blinking warnings, just a quiet web of connections, dates, names, routing numbers, lines that told their own story if you took the time to follow them. And still, the room held stillness. Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their seat. Another person coughed once, then stopped. The rhythm of the hearing, so predictable just moments ago, now seemed to hesitate between one breath and the next. Alexandria didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply continued, her tone almost conversational, as though she were reading from a well-worn briefing, not unveiling something no one had expected her to bring. The documentation traces funds from a U.S.-based political action committee through Tri-West Holdings, then into an overseas shell entity. The entity was registered 3 weeks prior to the transaction date. No known employees, no operational disclosures, but the paper trail is intact. She glanced once at the chairman, then at no one in particular. It wasn't performance. It was more like keeping time. On the screen, a new image appeared, an internal email, lightly redacted but still readable. A name at the top, a subject line that read, Zurich Routing, keep clean, and one sentence in the body that made at least 2 staffers in the room visibly react. If AOC ever sees this, it's over. No one spoke. There was nothing to add, nothing to refute, at least not yet. Leo, still seated a few rows behind, folded his arms slowly. He didn't look satisfied, just steady, like someone who knew the first stone had been placed, and that the wall would now build itself piece by piece. Alexandria closed her notepad. Not the binder. That remained where it was, untouched. She looked ahead again, not with triumph, but something quieter, firmer. And before the next question could be asked, she said one final line, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it carried. This wasn't meant to trend. It was meant to disappear. And now it wouldn't. There was something different about the way she opened the binder. No dramatic pause, no flourish. Just a gentle motion. Elastic band slid off, cover lifted, paper turned. Inside, the documents were neatly arranged, each section clipped and labeled by month, each page worn just slightly at the corner from repeated handling. These weren't fresh prints. They had been read, annotated, reread. She knew them by heart. Alexandria lifted the first page and placed it carefully on the table, just slightly angled toward the chairman. She didn't look up as she spoke. The following documentation outlines a financial sequence originating from a political account registered in the United States and terminating in a shell company based in Zurich. The intermediary structures include Tri-West Holdings and a holding service registered in Panama under a nominee ownership clause. No one interrupted. No one shifted in their seat. The silence wasn't hostile. It was just very still, like everyone was waiting to understand what exactly they were hearing. The screen behind her lit up again. Wired data began to appear, line by line, as her aide at the text station followed her cues without needing to be told. Each line came with a date, a timestamp, a source, and a recipient. The flow of money wasn't chaotic. It was measured, consistent, almost methodical. She continued calmly. The initial transfer, $3.2 million, passed through a dormant consultancy in Nevada before being routed through an investment firm in Luxembourg, eventually landing in an account held under the name New Point Strategic Consultants. The account was opened using identity documents verified under Swiss registration procedures. We've confirmed those documents match previous filings linked to campaign-adjacent firms. She paused, not to be dramatic, but simply to turn the next page. A new slide appeared, an internal email dated 6 weeks before the first transfer. The screen captured the text clearly. No need to zoom in. The recipient's name was partially blacked out, but the rest was intact. Subject line, Zurich Routing Strategy, keep off record. There were multiple bullet points. Alexandria read only one aloud. If AOC ever sees this, it's over. She let the sentence sit in the air for a moment, not to provoke a response, but because it was already doing enough on its own. Someone near the back of the chamber exhaled slowly. One member, who had up to that point been scrolling on his phone, now placed it face down and stared forward. A staffer moved to whisper something, then thought better of it. Alexandria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just looked down at the next page. Leo watched from the gallery. He knew what was coming next. What mattered wasn't just what she revealed, but how. The pacing, the care, the refusal to sensationalize what was already serious enough on its own. This wasn't an attack. It was an unveiling. Each document led to another, each detail anchored in context. Alexandria wasn't offering conclusions. She was offering facts, one after the other, laid bare like threads waiting to be traced, and she let the room feel it. Not all at once, but gradually, like heat rising through the floor. At first, the networks didn't realize what they were seeing. The committee hearing hadn't been marked as urgent, and most producers had scheduled that hour for filler news and lighter segments. But then came the email projection, the wire data, and the sentence, "If AOC ever sees this, it's over." Within minutes, MSNBC broke away from its midday programming. A producer in the control room leaned over and said, "We need to go to oversight. Right now." The anchor on screen hesitated, just for a beat, then shifted tone as the feed cut to the Capitol. CNN followed more cautiously. They'd missed the beginning, so what viewers first saw was AOC holding a document in one hand, flipping it carefully with the other. No outrage, no sound bites. Just her voice, low even, firm, laying out a financial trail that, at first glance, didn't seem theatrical. But the weight in her delivery made it clear. This wasn't routine. Producers scrambled to contextualize it live. Analysts whispered to each other off camera. One anchor paused mid-sentence, eyes darting to the teleprompter, which now read, "Breaking. AOC presents evidence linking former president to offshore transfer." Meanwhile, somewhere far from Washington, in a private room at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump sat in front of a muted television. The CSPAN broadcast had been left running in the background, more out of habit than attention. An aide had mentioned that oversight was meeting, but no one had expected much. That changed quickly. He looked up during one of the diagrams. At first, he leaned in slightly. A familiar name caught his eye. Tri-West Holdings. The screen changed again. Zurich. Atlas 12. Then came the email on screen. For a moment, he simply stared. No expression, just stillness. But when AOC read the line aloud, the one naming her directly, his face changed. The stillness broke. His hand reached for the remote. He turned up the volume and leaned forward as if volume would somehow change the meaning. Across the room, one of his aides froze mid-step. Another, already standing by the door, turned slowly. No one wanted to be the first to speak. He spoke first. "What is this?" he asked, but not like a question, more like a reaction he hadn't decided how to control. No one answered. Outside that room, the news had already reached social media. Within 20 minutes, TikTok was flooded with clips of AOC calmly flipping through papers as high-resolution images of wire transfers appeared behind her. The audio was quiet, steady, and serious, an unusual tone for the platform, but it held people's attention. Captions read, "She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just showed the receipts." Hashtags began trending. Hashtag Zurich transfer. Hashtag if AOC sees it. Hashtag the binder. On Twitter, reporters scrambled to verify what they were watching. Screenshots of the email with the redacted Trump org address began circulating, with users captioning them simply, "It's real." One journalist posted, "AOC just shifted the conversation in 10 minutes flat. No theatrics, just evidence." Back at Mar-a-Lago, Trump stood. He didn't yell, not immediately, but the redness in his face said more than words might have. The remote in his hand trembled slightly. He tossed it to the couch. Then came the voice. "She's bluffing," someone said, softly. He shook his head. "She's not." He waved them all out of the room. At Mar-a-Lago, the quiet didn't last. Within minutes of the hearing clip reaching full broadcast, voices began rising behind closed doors. The private room Trump had been watching from was no longer still. An aide tried to lower the volume. Another fumbled with a phone, pulling up headlines faster than he could read them. Trump stood now, not pacing yet, but unsettled. His posture stiff, his hand clenched by his side. His eyes didn't leave the screen, even when the footage looped. Again and again, AOC's voice repeated the same measured words. Her tone wasn't angry, just steady. Her binder stayed open. The email with his organization's redacted address stayed on the screen. Then came the sentence. Again, "If AOC ever sees this, it's over." He turned abruptly. The words came out fast, sharp, the kind that didn't wait for explanation. "I want her investigated. Now." One aide flinched. Another stepped back, unsure whether to nod or speak. No one in the room wanted to ask what for. They understood the point wasn't logic, it was urgency, control. Outside that room, His digital war room had already sprung to life. His Truth Social team had posted twice in 5 minutes. The first read, "Lies, fraud, puppet show for the radical left." The second was louder. "This is nothing but election interference. Witch hunt. Again." Inside the messaging group chat, there was confusion. They hadn't seen the full footage. They didn't have talking points yet. One advisor typed, "Do we confirm or deny Tri-West?" No one answered. In another corner of the mansion, 2 staffers sat at a long table, refreshing Twitter and TikTok. One of them spoke without looking up. "This is moving fast." The other nodded, eyes still on the screen. "Faster than we're ready for." Meanwhile, back in D.C., Alexandria closed her binder gently and placed it back in her bag. The hearing wasn't over, but her part had ended. For now. She thanked the chairman with a quiet nod, gathered her papers without rush, and stepped out of the room with the same calm energy she'd entered with. Reporters were already waiting. Microphones crowded the hallway. Voices rose from every direction. "Congresswoman, is the email authentic? Did you obtain these files legally? Are you accusing the former president of laundering funds?" She didn't answer. Not out of avoidance, but because nothing else needed to be said yet. The documents had spoken. The silence she carried was its own kind of reply. As she walked through the corridor, Leo followed a few steps behind. He wasn't rushing either. He glanced once at the reporters, then at her. She didn't look back. Just kept walking, binder in hand, head steady. Back in Mar-a-Lago, Trump had moved to the adjacent room, the one they called the war room during elections. The air felt heavy, thick with frustration and something quieter. Uncertainty. Not everyone was shouting. Some had gone still. At the center of the long table was a whiteboard with 3 columns: strategy, risk, media. Under risk, someone had written one word in red marker: Zurich. Trump looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down. His phone was still buzzing. Posts were going live. Supporters were responding, but not all in the same tone as before. Some called for action, others asked questions. A few simply said, "Is this real?" He didn't answer. He opened his phone, typed a new post, then deleted it before sending. Back in D.C., Alexandria reached the sidewalk and paused for a breath of cool air. She didn't smile. She didn't stop walking. But for the first time all morning, she let herself feel the weight of what had been set in motion. And somewhere across the country, people had begun to listen. The Capitol had long since emptied for the night. Lights in most offices were off, but AOC's window still glowed faintly. Inside, she sat cross-legged on the floor beside a low coffee table. Not behind her desk, not in heels, but in sneakers and an oversized hoodie with a quiet message stitched on the sleeve. Organize, don't agonize. The hour didn't matter. Some work demanded stillness, not timing. The hum of the radiator filled the silence, interrupted only by the scratch of her pen against a worn notepad. She wasn't rewriting a speech or drafting a press release. She was rereading something no one else seemed to care about anymore. A months-old audit summary buried 3 folders deep in a public database. No press, no spotlight. Just patterns she hadn't stopped thinking about. A quiet knock at the door startled her. Leo leaned in without waiting for an answer, holding a large manila envelope that looked like it had already lived a few lives. Creased edges, no return address. Just her name, handwritten in thick ink. He didn't smile. He closed the door gently behind him and said, "It was dropped off by a courier." No name, no message. Just this. She took it from him slowly and weighed it in her hands before pulling the flap open. Inside, a single folded document. Legal size, several lines redacted, the kind of redaction that wasn't done by accident. Even with whole sections blacked out, the visible fragments were enough to raise questions. A transfer. Tri-West Holdings. A project name she didn't recognize. And a payment to a firm that, according to Google, hadn't officially existed for over a decade. Leo hovered near the bookshelf, rubbing the bridge of his nose. This is real if it's what I think it is," he said quietly. His voice wasn't panicked, but something in it had tightened. And if it's real, then someone's been trying to cover it for a long time. AOC didn't respond right away. She kept rereading one line near the bottom of the invoice. It wasn't redacted, oddly, just left there, maybe on purpose. Consulting services rendered per verbal agreement. Zurich. She looked up, the quiet resolve in her face surfacing slowly. Then we're not backing away. Leo didn't answer. He didn't have to. He sat beside her, and together they began to do what no headline had done. Follow the silences, not the noise. The next few hours weren't dramatic. No dramatic discoveries. Just spreadsheets, maps, timelines, pieces that didn't make sense on their own, but taken together began to hum with something undeniable. Some things had been moved around too often to be coincidence. Some names popped up too frequently in places they didn't belong. And some gaps were only explainable if someone had made sure they'd stay gaps. Outside, the city was quiet. But inside that room, something had shifted. It wasn't adrenaline that kept them up that night. It was clarity. There was no press conference planned, no leaks to the media, not yet. Instead, she opened her binder, yes, that one, and began tucking pages inside with quiet care. One by one, like building something that needed to hold up under pressure. At one point, just before sunrise, Leo glanced at her and asked, "What if it leads where we think it might?" She paused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then it's exactly where we're supposed to go." And when the sun rose over the Capitol, few people knew that a single envelope, unasked for, unsigned, had already redrawn the path of the next season in American politics. Jalen Morey had worked at Mar-a-Lago for almost 5 years. He wasn't a decision maker or strategist, just an assistant who knew how to keep quiet, follow instructions, and organize documents that didn't always come with names or context. He didn't ask questions, not because he didn't care, but because questions got people noticed. And people who got noticed didn't tend to last long. He was 29, had a quiet way about him, and moved through the ornate hallways like someone who had long learned how to disappear inside them. Most of the senior staff barely remembered his last name, but that's also what made him dangerous without ever trying to be. It started on a Tuesday night, routine cleanup after a chaotic donor meeting that had run 2 hours late and left files, folders, and scribbled notes strewn across a conference table that still smelled of cigar smoke. Most of the documents were irrelevant. Talking points, golf schedules, duplicates of press statements already printed and thrown out. But one folder hadn't been opened. It was thick, unlabeled, and wedged beneath a pile of unused stationery. Jalen almost tossed it into the shred stack without looking until something made him pause. A logo he didn't recognize, a date that had been circled 3 times, and a handwritten note on the top page, "Ask Ron before sending this to Zurich." He shouldn't have read further, but he did. And once he did, he knew it wasn't just a policy briefing or draft speech. It was financial, layered, structured in a way that seemed designed to hide itself. Holdings, transfers, trusts connected to shell companies that had existed for just long enough to move money, then vanish. He didn't tell anyone, not his girlfriend, not even his brother, who lived across town and used to joke that Jalen worked in the Palace of Secrets. But the documents sat in his mind for days like a ticking sound he couldn't trace. He wasn't a political person. He'd never voted for AOC and had only ever seen clips of her when someone played them too loudly in the break room. But silence, he realized, had started to feel heavier than risk. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want his name on anything. What he wanted, what he needed, was for someone on the outside to see what he'd seen and decide what came next. So he did something strange, even to himself. He created an anonymous Proton Mail account and wrote a single sentence. "If she's still looking into Tri-West Holdings, tell her to ask Zurich why the July 14th transfer was split." He sent it to an unlisted email he'd found on a congressional subcommittee's outdated internal site, one that belonged to a junior aide named Priya Shah. Priya didn't recognize the sender, but something about the message made her stomach tighten. She'd seen Zurich before. Once. On a redacted invoice AOC had quietly flagged weeks earlier, and now it had appeared again, unsolicited, unprompted. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she printed the message, tucked it into her own binder, and walked down the hall toward AOC's office, heart steady but cautious. By the time AOC read the sentence, she didn't speak. She just circled the word split with her pen, then underlined July 14th twice. It wasn't confirmation, but it was weight, enough to lean on, enough to say, we're not alone in watching this anymore. And somewhere in a quiet apartment just outside Palm Beach, Jalen Morey turned off his laptop and placed the folder in a safe he'd never used until that week. Still not knowing what would happen next, only that something had already started. It was the kind of work no one really sees. No cameras, no viral clips, no grand declarations, just fluorescent lights, mugs of half-cold coffee, and the persistent rustle of paper, page after page that didn't make sense on its own, but together hinted at something that might. AOC sat at the corner of the long oak table in her office, legs crossed under her chair, a pen in hand but mostly forgotten. Across from her, Leo had rolled up his sleeves, laptop open, two screens lit up with spreadsheet grids and tax codes that bled together after too many hours. The binder sat between them, its spine wearing down, corners marked with yellow tabs. It no longer felt like a tool. It had become a companion, familiar, heavy in more ways than one. They weren't hunting for proof. That part, in a way, had already arrived, just not loudly. What they were doing now was building context, transactions that looked legal at first glance, until you saw that one company dissolved the same day it received funds. Donations logged publicly, then reclassified quietly. FEC filings where line 19 didn't match line 7, but only if you knew where to look. Leo pulled up a flagged document from months earlier, comparing it with a printed email from the envelope that had arrived that strange night. This routing number, it bounces between 3 banks in a 24-hour window, he murmured, and all 3 have different originating timestamps. AOC didn't look up. Keep going. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised anymore. What she felt was closer to steadiness, a clarity that settled in the chest, not the gut. She'd spent the first few years of her career being called impulsive, too young, too online, but none of that followed her here. In this room with this binder, she was quiet, focused, and slowly pulling at a thread that no one else had bothered to touch. Hours passed like that. Tax documents from IRS disclosures lined the wall behind them. Leo used a pink highlighter not because it meant anything, but because it was the only one left in the drawer. They laughed at that once, quietly, briefly, then kept going. Sometimes late at night, when the building fell still, and even the security guard stopped checking in, AOC would pause, not to rest, but to breathe. She wasn't chasing a headline. She wasn't angling for legacy. What she was doing felt simpler than that. She was preserving something, not just evidence, but memory, not just contradiction, but pattern. Every red mark told a story. At one point, Leo leaned back, rubbing his temples. You know this won't get you a thank you, right? She smiled faintly. I'm not collecting thank yous. Outside, the sky had begun to shift, a thin thread of blue trying to peek through the dark. Somewhere below, the city was beginning to stir again, unaware of how many small dots had just been connected above it. And as Leo printed the final comparison sheet, one that tied a suspicious consultancy firm in Nevada to a passkey registered under a shell name in Delaware, he paused. You think they'll understand this? He asked. AOC looked at the binder, the pages, the marks, the notes scribbled in the margins. She closed it gently, her hand resting on the cover like one might on a book that had finally given up its secret. This binder isn't revenge, she said almost to herself. It's the record. And that was enough. It didn't take long. The clip of AOC calmly asking that first question, binder resting quietly beside her, traveled across the internet with a speed that no campaign strategist could have planned and no PR firm could have manufactured. By dawn the next day, it had been watched over 40 million times. It wasn't just the question, it was how she asked it. No anger, no performance, just clarity, just timing. And the binder, always the binder. The hashtag came from a teenager in Seattle who clipped the moment and added 3 words above the video. She warned them. By the time she got to school that morning, hashtag the binder had started trending. By noon, it was the #1 topic worldwide. Cable news scrambled to catch up. MSNBC called it a meticulous takedown. CNN tried to explain the mechanics behind the shell companies, only to realize their viewers weren't interested in numbers. They were interested in motive. Fox News, visibly unsettled, flipped between minimizing the allegations and attacking AOC's credibility. One anchor paused mid-broadcast and said, "It's just paper. Anyone can print paper." But what unsettled many wasn't the content. It was the tone. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't even raised her voice. And yet somehow it sounded louder than any hearing they'd seen in years. Commentators flooded timelines with their takes. Supporters framed her as a truth teller, calm under pressure, relentless in the details, careful with her words. They posted screenshots of her flipping pages, labeled her style forensic grace, and added side-by-side images of her binder next to courtroom evidence boards from fictional dramas. Jokes were made, memes were born, but the backlash was quick and fierce. "She's trying to burn the system down," one congressman posted. "Who funds her? Who gave her this?" asked another, implying foreign influence without evidence. One headline read, "Fearless or Reckless? Ocasio-Cortez accused of weaponizing committee hearings." Another, "Binder Bombshell, AOC's 5 minutes that could break Washington." Her inbox filled with both thank you letters and veiled threats. Her district office received flowers and voicemails within the same hour, one calling her the last honest one standing, another telling her to watch her back. She didn't respond to any of it publicly, not yet. Inside her office, Leo skimmed a list of articles and paused at one particularly blunt line from a conservative blogger. "If she's not stopped, she'll rewrite the rules by Tuesday." Priya, seated by the window, sighed. "They're not mad because you lied. They're mad because it wasn't them saying it first." AOC leaned back, binder now closed on the table, fingers steepled. "We didn't write this to go viral." "I know," Leo said without looking up. "But the truth has an algorithm too, and this one just hit the front page." Outside, the Hill buzzed with press fans and protesters and supporters holding signs with hand-drawn binders. Some called for hearings. Others called for her resignation. The same symbol, cardboard binder silhouettes, meant two entirely different things depending on who was holding them. And through it all, she stayed quiet. For now, not to retreat, but to listen, to see who showed their hand in the noise, to learn which voices echoed too loudly and which stayed quiet. Quiet in a way that meant something. Because in this town, the silence around a name was often louder than the headlines that spelled it out. By the third morning after the hearing, the country no longer felt still. A small church in upstate New York had quietly changed its roadside sign to read, "Truth doesn't care who you voted for." The next morning, the letters were gone, scraped off, the plastic warped. Spray paint streaked across the back wall. No cameras caught it, but someone left behind a crumpled flyer near the door. Patriotism means knowing when to shut up. It wasn't isolated. Outside AOC's district office in Queens, the sidewalk turned into a collision of cardboard, voices, and convictions. One side held signs that read, "Fake files and impeach her." The other, "We believe her and show us the rest." There were drums, bullhorns, lawn chairs. A woman handed out tamales from a foil tray, saying softly, "She's not lying. We've seen this before. It just looks different now." Inside the office, the blinds stayed drawn. Leo stood near the door, arms folded, his phone buzzing nonstop with alerts. New articles, threatening emails, requests for interviews. "They're trying to drown it in noise," he muttered. AOC didn't respond right away. She was at her desk, looking not at her screen, but out the side window where you could just make out the edge of a mural someone had painted overnight. A figure in a red blazer with a binder in hand. Not a perfect likeness, but unmistakable. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't permissioned either. She didn't move to remove it. On TikTok, kids had started remixing C-SPAN clips of her testimony with slow piano music and captions like, "They tried to call her angry. She showed them patient." One edit ended with, "This is not a scandal. This is a timeline correction." But not everyone was sentimental. A man in Texas live-streamed himself burning a paper labeled "Binder Lies" on his front lawn. A conservative radio host mocked her voice as too steady to trust. A senator suggested she should be evaluated for delusions of grandeur. The phrase caught on. Posters appeared in D.C. with her face and the words, dangerous calm. And still she said nothing. It wasn't absence. It was choice. In the office, Priya scrolled through hundreds of emails, some long and aching, others just a single line. Thank you for not yelling. Or my father worked for Tri-West. He never knew. AOC eventually stood, walking slowly toward the front, passing the coat rack where the same maroon blazer had hung for days. She didn't put it on. She just paused beside it, fingertips brushing the sleeve. Let it play out, she said quietly. Leo looked up. They're painting you as a threat. I know. They think silence is retreat. She turned her gaze to the closed blinds where faint chants drifted in from the street like wind slipping through a cracked window. I'm not here to interrupt their yelling, she said. I'm here to outlast it. Outside, someone had begun chalking words on the sidewalk. Receipts aren't noise. They're memory. No one knew who wrote it, but someone added a heart at the end. By the end of the fourth day, the inboxes no longer felt like channels for dialogue. They became something else. Dense, volatile, relentless. Leo sat hunched at his desk, skimming messages with practiced speed, flagging only what needed to be reported. Some were short and crude. Others sounded almost formal, as if hate in full sentences hurt less. But all carried the same undertone, an effort to make her flinch. Subject lines blurred together. Traitor. Go back to bartending. We know where she sleeps. And then quietly, a link began circulating. Her apartment building, then a partial address, then a full one. A photo someone had taken weeks ago, grainy but unmistakable. The brick facade, the black door. Leo didn't show it to her right away. Instead, he stared at his own phone. His name had been posted too, and his college, and the hospital where his brother worked. He closed the browser. Meanwhile, in the back office, Priya sifted through physical mail, old-fashioned letters that came in envelopes with real handwriting. Some were just blank sheets with slurs. One envelope held nothing but a single word typed in bold font. Regret. She held that one longer than she meant to. Back in AOC's workspace, the window stayed cracked an inch open despite the late chill. She sat without speaking, binder still beside her. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and lavender hand cream. What do they expect us to do? Leo asked finally, setting down his phone. Break rhythm, she said softly. Get louder, or disappear. But she didn't do either. Later that afternoon, as the team packed up, Priya quietly handed her a letter. The envelope was torn at the corner, the ink a little smudged. Came with the others, she said. But I think it's different. It was. The handwriting was careful, steady, military almost. Congresswoman, I served 23 years in uniform. I've lived long enough to know silence by design when I see it. Thank you for saying it out loud. That took more courage than most wars I've seen. Keep your guard up. And please, don't back down. M.S. Randall, U.S. Army, retired. AOC read it twice, then folded it, not into her binder, but into her coat pocket. Not all letters belonged in archives. Outside, the chants had grown quieter. Not because people stopped shouting, but because some were finally listening in stillness. In that silence, threats still came. But so did something else. Proof that even when the system tried to drown truth in venom, a single note of clarity could still make it to shore. And that was enough, for now. The second hearing didn't feel like a sequel. It felt like a return. Only this time the ground was different beneath her feet. The same corridor, the same muted walls and flickering overhead lights, the same security officers nodding as she passed. But AOC's pace was different. Not faster, just steadier. Not louder, just unmistakably clear. She held the same binder under her arm, though now it bore the faint marks of frequent flipping. The edges were softening, the tabs slightly curled, like it had been lived in, like it had earned its weight. This time the room greeted her with more eyes up than down. Not everyone looked ready. Some shuffled papers just to keep their hands busy. Some avoided her gaze entirely. But a few, including the chairman, sat unusually still, as if they'd rehearsed poise but hadn't practiced how to breathe with it. Leo stood near the back wall, as always. But his shoulders weren't as tight today. No opening statement, no warm-up. She walked to her seat, opened the binder halfway, and spoke just above the hum of the air conditioning. "Madam Chair," she said, voice even, "I'd like to draw your attention to an account registration filed with a financial institution headquartered in Zurich. You'll find it's dated February 3rd, 2021. She turned slightly, motioning to the technician. Behind her, the screen blinked on. No graphics, no build-up. Just a scanned copy of a single page. One line of text at the top. Client confirmation receipt. Privé access. Alpine Trust, Switzerland. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn toward the cameras. She simply continued. It remained unflagged due to its routing origin. Liechtenstein via South Dakota intermediary, if you're curious, and the obscured ownership clause. That is, until this signature surfaced. A red square blinked onto the screen. Then it zoomed. A name, handwritten in thick black ink. Donald J. Trump. The loop on the J arched high. The flourish on the T dragged below the line. It was unmistakable, because it had been copied so many times before. On executive orders, on hats, on real estate deeds, but never until now in this context. The room didn't gasp. It just stopped. AOC looked up once, briefly. This document was never meant to be examined. It was meant to exist in silence. No one spoke. She flipped one page forward, calm as a librarian. The next tab read, Subsection B, Beneficiaries and Payout Triggers. But she didn't go there yet. She closed the binder halfway and leaned back slightly, not in triumph, but in assurance. Because the facts were no longer rumors. They weren't theories. They had ink. They had timestamps. They had the signature of a man who had, for years, dismissed oversight as theater. And now he was in the script, whether he had memorized his lines or not. Outside the chamber, reporters scrambled to piece together meaning, but inside the silence was its own statement. No shouting, no protests, just the slow, shifting weight of what it meant to see something real and be unable to look away. She didn't rush into it. After the signature, the room was already on edge. No one dared make noise, yet no one dared relax either. It was the kind of stillness that didn't invite silence, but demanded it. The kind that made pens heavy and throat clears feel intrusive. AOC let a few seconds pass, not for drama, but for clarity. Then without fanfare, she turned the binder again, this time to a printed wire log that spanned half a page. Not a bank statement, not even a full transaction chain. Just a list of reference codes and note fields tied to offshore movements, sandwiched between Swiss institutions and a Delaware LLC. She pointed to the fourth line. Atlas 12, she read aloud. The words themselves sounded innocuous, almost sterile, a generic name, something you'd forget in a headline. But in the context of the table, it carried an odd weight. The wire, dated January 4th, 2021, landed exactly 48 hours before the Georgia Senate runoff, a race that had determined control of the upper chamber. The amount was just under reporting thresholds. The metadata linked back to a campaign-adjacent PAC. But it wasn't the number that mattered. It was the memo field. She looked toward the chair, gently lifting a second sheet with more clarity than volume. This field, she said softly, was not scrubbed. It read, Final push, Atlas 12 confirmed, GA/flip priority. Someone near the back of the room inhaled sharply, like they just remembered what it meant to breathe through disbelief. No one interrupted, but a quiet stir rustled among the committee. Not angry, not reactive, just confused, unmoored. AOC's voice stayed even, steady, but you could feel the current underneath. You cannot fund democracy, she said, with money designed to bypass it. No accusations, just that single line, offered without elevation. Someone dropped a pen near the GOP end of the bench. It bounced once, then rolled quietly under the table. No one moved to retrieve it. One of the older members across the aisle leaned closer to his aide, whispered something. She just shook her head, as if to say yes. She double-checked that part. The phrase Atlas 12 was already trending by the time her second document appeared. MSNBC was running a ticker. Twitter had 100 theories. Some believed it was code for voter analytics. Others thought it referred to a military contract. But within minutes, the connection had been made publicly. Atlas 12 was the informal code name used in internal GOP chats to reference the final spending surge in Georgia. The one that flooded airwaves with last-minute ads and SMS campaigns, now potentially tainted by undisclosed foreign origin money. But AOC didn't need to say all that. She didn't wave her arms. She didn't twist the knife. She just paused again, looked around the room, and closed the binder. Not abruptly, but like someone concluding a sentence. The chair asked eventually if she had anything else to add. She shook her head. Not yet. And that yet wasn't a threat. It was a promise carried gently, like everything she'd said that day. Because it wasn't about the volume of her voice. It was about the weight of what was already sitting in the record. And the committee knew, for the first time in a long time, that they couldn't pretend they hadn't heard it. It didn't erupt all at once. The tension had been building, thread by thread, until it finally frayed at the edges. The first objection came in the form of a cough, the kind people use when they want to interrupt without being ruled out of order. Then came a voice from the Republican side, louder this time, objecting to the source of the documents. Another demanded immediate verification. A third stood and pointed across the room, not at AOC but toward the chair, asking how such materials were allowed to be presented without prior notice. And through it all, AOC didn't move. Her hands remained where they were, one resting lightly atop the binder, the other calmly turning a page, not to make a point, but simply because she wasn't done reading yet. The chairman called for quiet, but his voice strained under the weight of the moment. The gavel came down, once, then again, each strike landing harder, but achieving less. The chamber, usually filled with predictable rhythms and rehearsed indignation, now pulsed with something raw. Some members stood, shouting over one another. Staffers leaned in, phones vibrating with new updates. A camera light in the back blinked red, still recording, still live. And yet AOC remained the one still point in the spinning room. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to repeat anything. What had been shown was already echoing beyond the walls. Atlas 12, the memo field, the signature. Another representative accused her of ambush theatrics. Someone else asked for immediate adjournment. A few muttered about leaks and legality and called her evidence foreign disinformation. It was as if shouting might somehow unprint the documents, as if urgency could erase what had been quietly prepared. The chairman finally leaned into his mic, voice sharper this time, demanding order. But order wasn't really the problem. It was the loss of control. That was what they were reacting to, not the facts themselves, but the realization that something had shifted and they hadn't seen it coming. In the flurry of protest, one image lingered. AOC still seated, not defensive, not smug, just present, focused. The binder still open, the page still visible. She wasn't yelling, someone whispered afterward, but everyone else was. And maybe that was what unsettled them most, because the chaos hadn't been caused by an outburst. It had come from the quiet, from a methodical, deliberate laying out of facts that couldn't be shouted down. No podium pounding, no grand speech, just a record, and the silence that followed its entry. By the end of the session, the chair recessed the committee, his voice tight with protocol. No resolution was passed, no conclusions drawn, just a scattering of notes, phones, sidelong glances, and unfinished sentences. AOC gathered her binder, nodded once to the clerk, and walked out. Not triumphantly, not even quickly. Just as she had arrived, prepared. And the room, still humming from what had happened, didn't quite know whether it had just seen a scandal unravel or accountability begin. It started as a flicker in the corner of Priya's screen, a new ping in the encrypted line they'd set up weeks ago, but never fully expected to use. No name, no subject, just a small gray icon blinking. She hesitated for a second, then clicked. The message was brief. It's me. I'm ready. Drop confirmed. Same spot. It's all there. I didn't plan to be brave. I just couldn't pretend anymore. No signature, of course, but she didn't need one. She knew the cadence by now, the quiet restraint, the way he avoided absolutes. Jalen Morey, the quiet aide buried deep in Mar-a-Lago logistics, who somehow had stumbled across more than any intern should have ever been near. Priya didn't reply. She just closed the laptop, wrapped her scarf around her neck, and walked out. No calls, no meetings, just a train ticket to Baltimore and the worn messenger bag she only used when something mattered. The drop location wasn't cinematic, just a used bookstore near the harbor that kept its back door bin unlocked for overnight deliveries. It smelled of ink and damp cardboard. Priya slipped the envelope inside a cracked copy of The Road to Serfdom, just like they agreed. She didn't linger. She didn't look around. Back in D.C., the air was already shifting. Rumors circulated about internal fractures, sudden exits from campaign teams, lawyers lawyering up in whispers. AOC kept her calendar sparse, but her mind full. Every morning she checked her email from Priya like a farmer checking soil. Carefully, quietly, knowing what she planted weeks ago was only now starting to surface. Jalen had never imagined this moment. He hadn't set out to be a whistleblower. He had just wanted the job, the resume line, the steady paycheck. He had kept his head down for most of it, refilling briefing folders, printing boarding passes, coordinating last-minute donor dinners where no one remembered his name. But that afternoon in the archive room, when he noticed a sealed folder marked Atlas 12, external, he'd paused, not out of defiance, out of curiosity, and then regret. He hadn't meant to open it. He just didn't walk away. And once the screen lit up with scanned wire routes and code names linked to campaign stops, he knew. He wouldn't unknow. The first time he contacted Priya, it was tentative. "There's something weird I found. I don't know what to do." He hadn't even told her his name at first. She hadn't pushed. She just listened. Slowly, over weeks, trust formed, not built through declarations, but through silence that wasn't judged. Now, with his final file set delivered and no more to hide, Jalen sat on the floor of his apartment, knees pulled to his chest. He'd locked every door, unplugged his devices, covered the peephole. But still, it wasn't fear that sat with him. It was relief, not comfort, just that slight unclenching of the jaw he hadn't realized he'd been holding for months. Meanwhile, in her office, AOC turned each page slowly. Most of it was redacted, but the patterns were enough. Internal memos, digital timestamps, account transfers, pseudonyms that matched hotel reservations. It wasn't a bombshell, not in the way TV producers liked, but it was something harder to argue with: continuity, the shape of intent. She didn't call anyone. She didn't plan a press release. She just exhaled deeply and looked out the window toward the Capitol. She wasn't alone in this anymore. And someone, somewhere, who had everything to lose had just confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't about ambition or airtime. It was about deciding not to look away. Jalen had once believed silence kept him safe. Now he understood that sometimes it only keeps others in danger. And with that, the story moved again. Not with a bang, but with a whisper that chose truth over comfort. The message came in like many others had, hidden behind a disposable email. No subject line, no punctuation. But this one was different. It wasn't shouting insults or accusing her of lies. It was shorter, colder. "We know where your sister lives." It sat in AOC's inbox for 22 seconds before she moved. Then, without a word, she forwarded it to Leo and turned off the screen. She didn't react the way her team expected. No shaking, no sharp breath. Just silence. The kind that shifts the room. By the next morning, office routines had changed. 2 staffers started rotating night shifts just to monitor public-facing accounts. Priya started walking to her car with a second aide, keys looped through her fingers. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This had moved past politics. Still, the work didn't stop. AOC showed up. Meetings stayed on calendar. The binder, same one since the first hearing, never left her side. It wasn't performance, it was choice. To stay visible. Not in defiance, but in clarity. But clarity has a cost. And sometimes that cost knocks from home. Her mother's voice came soft through the line. "Mi amor, I saw the news. The internet. And now this. Is it really worth all this? There was no anger in her tone. Only fear worn soft over years. The kind only a mother carries. AOC sat in the dim of her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, the city just beyond the window. She let the question sit between them for a beat. Then another. Finally, she answered, "Mommy, I didn't come this far just to stay quiet when it matters most." There was no speech behind it, just truth. Not one meant for cameras or the floor of Congress, but for the small kitchen table they used to eat arroz con habichuelas at, where debates began over dinner and ended in hand-holding prayers. The threats didn't stop. If anything, they became more careful, less visible. That's what made them harder, not knowing where the line between warning and danger blurred. But amid the murkiness, something else surfaced. Resilience that didn't need an audience. Leo noticed it first. The way staff stayed late without being asked. The way they gently pulled each other aside to say, "I've got you." People stopped asking if they should continue. They just did. In one quiet moment, Priya left a sticky note on AOC's desk. No names, no reference. Just a sentence. "You're not carrying this alone." It wasn't dramatic, just steady, like the heartbeat of a room learning how to hold each other up. And across the country, scattered like raindrops, small voices began to push back too. An anonymous message from a high school civics teacher. "I used your hearing in class today." A letter from a nurse in El Paso. "They tried to scare me out of my job last year. You reminded me why I stayed." Each note didn't erase the danger, but it layered something else over it, something firmer than fear. One evening alone in her office, AOC stood at the window. Outside, traffic crawled, life kept moving. Somewhere, someone was still planning to intimidate her into silence. But inside, she felt something steadier than rage, a quiet rootedness, a knowing. They didn't want her speech. They wanted her silence, because silence wouldn't echo, wouldn't ripple. But she had made peace with risk long before she'd made headlines. And if they were counting on fear to do the silencing, they had misread her story entirely. She picked up a pen and wrote 5 words on a notepad for herself, small and slow. They can't erase what's spoken. The paper was plain. No logo, no flashy watermark, just a set of numbers, a name, and a path that didn't quite add up until it did. AOC sat alone in the dim evening quiet of her office, highlighter in hand, eyes scanning line after line with a steady focus. No sound but the soft scratch of fluorescent ink against photocopy. It wasn't new. The shell company had surfaced before, an anonymous name tucked inside a property deed in Florida, but now the wire trails matched. A loop of campaign funds disguised through consulting fees, bounced through 2 holding accounts, then quietly deposited into the down payment of a luxury beach estate just weeks before the midterms. She circled the final figure, $2.17 million, then underlined the dates, carefully. Once, she exhaled through her nose slowly and whispered more to herself than to anyone else. "The numbers don't lie, but some people hope you won't notice." Across the room, Leo looked up. He didn't interrupt. He had learned her rhythm by now. When to speak, when to listen, and when to just sit still while truth untangled itself on paper. At that moment, Priya's phone buzzed. One word. From a secure line. From a contact whose name they never saved. Worth. She didn't respond. Just placed the phone face down and looked out the window. For a second, she let herself imagine Jalen, wherever he was, reading that same printout in silence, watching the ripple of his action take form in congressional ink. AOC returned the final page to the binder, the now familiar binder, the one that had weathered headlines, hearings, and hallway stares. It was nothing special to look at, just a standard Capitol Hill issue. But inside it carried something that was becoming harder to come by in public life. Verification without volume. Substance without spectacle. Her finger traced the edge of the last tab. Exhibit G. It felt small on the page, but massive in context. Because this wasn't just about the number. It was about what the number stood for. The casual boldness of corruption done in daylight, packaged as routine. And the even bolder gamble that no one would care enough or dare enough to follow the line all the way through. She remembered something her father once said when she was 13, trying to decide whether to call out a student who had cheated on a group project. It's not always your job to fix the mess, but it's always your job not to pretend it's clean. That stayed with her, even now. And maybe that's what made Jalen's one-word message so heavy. He didn't say safe. He didn't say thanks. He said worth. As if, in the quiet math of consequence, he had measured risk against integrity and chosen not to subtract himself from the equation. That was what this document was too. A quiet accounting of choices that had stacked up over time, unchecked. A political ledger some hoped would stay in shadows. But it was on record now. Before leaving for the night, AOC clipped the final set of documents together. She didn't slam it shut or pose for cameras. She just added a small tab at the bottom corner of the last sheet, handwritten in pen. Line drawn, not a threat, not a headline, just clarity. Later, as the lights dimmed and the building settled into its nightly stillness, she stood at the threshold of her office, hand on the knob. The hall outside was empty, just polished floors and soft echoes. She paused for a beat, thinking not of the scandal, not of the threats, not even of the next hearing, but of a man she'd never met who sat with knowledge too heavy to carry and chose to hand it forward anyway. Some lines, she thought, can be erased, but some, when drawn with intention, become part of the foundation. She walked out without looking back. By the time she arrived in Shreveport, the air was thick with the kind of stillness that lives between opinions. AOC had visited before, but never like this. This time, the invitation wasn't from a campus group or a progressive caucus. It was from a librarian. A small, folded letter had been mailed weeks earlier. No hashtags, no headline. Just a handwritten sentence. People here still want to ask questions. The community forum was held in the back room of a Methodist church. No live stream, no press. Just 60 folding chairs, a coffee urn that never quite brewed strong enough, and a line of index cards for anyone who wanted to speak without standing. Outside, the town was split. Yard signs in opposing colors sat beside each other like awkward neighbors. Radio stations debated whether she was exposing a crime or inventing one. Even within families, people were unsure what to believe anymore. The documents, the headlines, or their gut. But inside that room, things felt quieter. Not easy, but quieter. She opened with no script, just thanked them for showing up and said she was here to listen just as much as she was to speak. She didn't go line by line through evidence. She didn't list every shell company or wire transfer again. People had heard enough numbers. What they hadn't heard much of lately was honesty without theater. A man near the back asked if it was true that someone on her team had gone into hiding. She nodded gently. He's safe, she said, but not untouched. A pause. None of us are. Another woman, older, quiet voice, raised her hand slowly. She didn't wait to be called on. My son went to jail for less, she said. Not angry, not accusatory, just tired. He made one bad decision, and it cost him 4 years of his life. We never got a hearing, just a sentence. The room held its breath. AOC met her eyes and didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch, just long enough to honor the weight of it. Then, thank you for saying that. More people spoke, some skeptical, some grateful, some just confused. But it wasn't yelling. It wasn't performance. It was people trying to find footing again in a country that often felt like it was arguing with itself in circles. After the forum, a few stayed behind. A high school teacher who had driven in from Baton Rouge handed her a note folded like a student's quiz. Your calm is louder than their panic. In the hallway, the librarian who invited her offered a paper bag of biscuits for the road and whispered, We don't all agree here, but we see when someone shows up. On the drive back, AOC sat quiet for most of the ride, the forum still echoing in her thoughts. She wasn't sure what moved her most, the woman who spoke of her son, or the way the room didn't clap afterward. No applause, no instant reaction, just reflection. And maybe that was the shift, not in headlines or approval polls, but in small church rooms, in slow questions, in the hush after a hard truth is spoken, the kind of hush where people actually hear one another. She looked out the window as the car pulled onto the highway, town lights fading behind her. In her lap, she unfolded the teacher's note again, not to reread it, just to feel it there. The Capitol had quiet corners if you knew where to look, not the marbled ones tourists photographed, but the soft in-betweens. The window ledge just off the stairwell, the creaky hallway outside the staff mailroom, the narrow pane of silence between hearings when even the walls seemed to pause. That morning, AOC found herself in one of those spaces, not quite ready to speak, not quite needing to move. Her binder rested on her lap, the familiar one, navy cover, spine fraying just slightly. Inside it, carefully tucked between two marked-up reports, something new caught her eye. Not a printed memo or briefing sheet, just a single folded slip of paper. She recognized Leo's handwriting before she even opened it. Small, square letters. Steady but always slightly left-leaning, as if they too were nudging toward change. It read, "They'll say you went too far, but they'll know where the line is now." She didn't smile, didn't frown either. It was more like her breath settled somewhere deeper for a moment. Leo had always been better with timing than with praise. He rarely gave reassurances, not because he lacked them, but because he believed in letting people walk their own edge. Quiet support, never loud defense. But this note, it was both. She read it again, slower, and something in it landed gently where weariness had been growing. It didn't erase the tension or the exhaustion or the very real fear that sometimes followed her home like a shadow. But it reminded her that this path, however uncomfortable, had shape, that the discomfort wasn't disorder, it was boundary setting, even if others refused to name it. The binder had become heavier lately, not just with documents and printed testimony, but with what they carried: accusations, confirmations, contradictions, and the slow throb of consequence. But here, in the middle of all that, was a sentence that didn't accuse or confirm or calculate. It just affirmed. And that somehow made room to keep going. She folded the note back along its original crease. No flourish, no ceremony, just careful hands, as if returning something to its proper place wasn't a task, but a form of gratitude. Outside the office window, she could hear the city beginning its usual hum, heels against tile, security radios flickering to life, the faint buzz of news alerts landing like bees on every phone. But inside, for just a breath longer, the room stayed still. She slipped the note back between the pages, not as a secret, more as a companion, the kind of message you don't need to reread to remember, but you still like knowing it's there. And as she stood, binder in hand, posture steady, she didn't rehearse what came next. She didn't need to. The line had already been drawn, and for once it wasn't her crossing it. It was her marking it clearly, with language they couldn't blur and evidence they couldn't redact. She walked back toward the hallway where the session would soon begin. But before turning the corner, she let one hand rest on the binder's edge, just for a second. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was presence. It was late. The kind of late where even the streetlights outside seemed softer, where buildings whispered instead of stood, and the world moved just slowly enough for reflection to finally catch up. AOC sat at her desk, a single lamp pooling light across the worn wooden surface. The binder, the one that had followed her through weeks of hearings, threats, protests, and truth-telling, rested quietly to her left. Its weight had shifted, still heavy, but not burdensome, more like something earned. She opened her journal, not for a headline, not for the record, just for herself. Her pen moved slowly, as if every word needed to arrive at its own pace. They hid it in systems, in silence, in fear. "I found it in a binder," she paused. There were other sentences she could have added, about the nights she questioned her own stamina, about the emails she never replied to because the words were too cruel to deserve answers, about the calls from friends telling her to be careful, and the calls from strangers telling her to disappear. But tonight didn't ask for all of that. Tonight asked only for honesty. She continued, almost in a murmur, writing without rushing, letting thought guide ink. They built entire careers on pretending not to see. But the math didn't lie. The transfers, the names, the quiet redirections. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. Her hand stilled. She looked out the window. Across the street, a street cleaner hummed by, unnoticed by most. Steady, methodical, doing what needed to be done even when no one was watching. That felt familiar. She turned back to the page, finishing the entry. I don't know if this will change everything. Maybe it won't change enough, but it showed people something they weren't supposed to see. And now that they've seen it, they can't unsee it. That matters. That always matters. She set the pen down gently. Silence settled into the room like an old friend. Not heavy, not hollow, just honest. She leaned back in her chair, letting the quiet stretch out. There was no applause in this space, no click of cameras, no swirl of reporters or rebuttals. Just her, the journal, and the knowledge that she had said what needed to be said, not for spectacle, but for clarity. Her voice when it came was nearly a whisper, but it didn't shake. Truth doesn't need volume, she said to no one in particular. Then, softer still, just daylight. She closed the journal, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself rest. Not because the work was done, but because she had done it with both hands open. The binder stayed on the desk, still closed, still full. But now it wasn't just filled with what they had tried to hide. It was filled with the choice to see anyway. This story isn't about a binder or even a scandal. It's about the quiet courage to confront what others prefer to ignore. AOC's final journal entry reminds us that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits for someone willing to carry it into the light. The power here lies not in grand gestures, but in the steady act of not looking away. Jalen's quiet bravery, Priya's trust, and AOC's endurance show how change often begins in silence and then slowly, unshakably, becomes undeniable. What about you? Have you ever chosen to speak up even when no one asked you to? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.